Hello everyone, Dr. Jazzy Fresh is back with another part of my Final Fantasy Universe Theory series. This series was born through Final Fantasy games alluding to each other, be it through repeated characters such as Gilgamesh, Omega, and the various incarnations of Sid, magical crystals, and the battle between light warriors and dark entities. Other allusions began to connect the games to an overarching universe and even to our own solar system. I started to connect the stories of Final Fantasy 1 through 16, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, and Final Fantasy Type O, so 18 games in total, mostly through the ongoing tale of Final Fantasy XIV, and from additional details revealed in Final Fantasy Dissidia, Final Fantasy Stranger of Paradise, novels, and Ultimanias. As a recap from Part 1, I began to chronologically place the Final Fantasy games as reference to events that occurred in Final Fantasy XIV. The first event was the character Medion traveling to other planets. The second event to occur was the sundering or splitting of the source planet of Aetheres into 13 reflections. 7 reflections rejoined with the source, causing calamities each time. 1 was lost to the void, or supreme primordial darkness, and remains on its own planet, now called the 13th. While 5 planets remain free. As proposed in Part 1 of my Theory series, some of the planets Medion visited provided homeworlds for Final Fantasy XI, Type O, 5, 13, 10, and 15. I call this time the Pre-Sundering Era. Based on other in-game content, I put Final Fantasy XI as the first game to occur, followed by Final Fantasy Type 0, Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy 13, and Final Fantasy 12. I propose Medion visited the worlds of Final Fantasy XI, 5, 13, and the home world of Ultima from Final Fantasy 16 after the main events us gamers played through. In other words, Medion arrived at a future time point from the original story's timeline in which the world was dying. If you want to hear in-depth details of how I place these Final Fantasy games, I highly recommend that you check out Part 1 of my Theory series. In summary, I placed Final Fantasy XI's Vanadil on the desert wasteland planet called India. Final Fantasy V's planet R became Alphatron, as it's the origin world for Omega. Final Fantasy XIII's Nova Crystalia I placed on the devoid of life planet called Henna. And Final Fantasy XVI's character, Ultima's homeworld, was said to have died due to a blight, or in other words a plague, and environmental decay. So naturally, I placed it on the planet of Tessera. However, the main events of Final Fantasy XVI would occur on a different planet. On the flip side, she also arrived at planets that were just starting out, including a frozen planet called Dio, which could be Final Fantasy XV's Eos due to Shiva's initial ice age, and a planet called Hepta, inhabited by fiends, which could be Final Fantasy X's Spira, as mentioned by characters that fiends inhabited the world possibly first. Furthermore, I believe the planet called Decapente is the world of Orions from Final Fantasy Type O. In this case, Medion visited the planet at some point during their endless time loop and encountered a character who turned against the people they were leading to then kill themselves, who I believe to be Marshal Sid. Lastly, I believe that Final Fantasy XII and Final Fantasy XIV are occurring around the same time, since they share deities and Medion probably did not visit this world. The game introduced 24 Xions created by the gods called Ikuria from Final Fantasy XII, 13 of Light, and 13 of Darkness. The dark ones are Espers of Final Fantasy XII, while the light ones are the Convocation members of Final Fantasy XIV. Zodiac is present in both games as an optional Esper boss in Final Fantasy XII, but as a main deity in Final Fantasy XIV. His description in Final Fantasy XII labels him as a child, and the gods feared his strength, so Zodiac was made in Final Fantasy XII's time, but summoned to Final Fantasy XIV once the vessel was provided. In Final Fantasy XIV, the Dark Primal Zodiac was summoned by the people of Aetheres to prevent the destruction of their world, which was going to be through what's called the Final Days. But this method came at too high a cost. The person who became the Light Primal Hydaelyn was a woman named Venat. In Final Fantasy XII, Venat is one of the Ikuria, or one of the supreme deities of the world of Ivalice. In Final Fantasy XIV, Hydaelyn was created to stop Zodiac and impede the Final Days, which led to the sundering of Zodiac and the sundering of their world into 13 reflections. This leads me to my second theory, planets. In part 2 of my theory series, I introduced the idea of placing Final Fantasy worlds on planets that mimic our own solar system. This is a theory I had from the beginning, honestly. I decided to finally circle back to it. As our solar system contains 8 main planets and many dwarf planets, I thought of which ones these games could take place on. Some games mentioned their exact location or gave hints. The rest I based off of symbolism and mythology references. The games of the Pre-Sundering Era essentially ended up on most of the outer celestial bodies, while the Post-Sundering ones ended up on most of the inner celestial bodies. I placed Final Fantasy XI on Saturn, Final Fantasy Type 0 on Sedna, Final Fantasy V on Makimaki, Final Fantasy XIII on Uranus, Final Fantasy XII on Neptune, Final Fantasy XIV on Haumea, Final Fantasy XIV's the 13th on Eris, Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy II on Jupiter, Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 8 on Venus, Final Fantasy 3, 1, and 6 on Mercury, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles and Final Fantasy 9 on Mars, Final Fantasy 4's Lunarians on Ceres, Final Fantasy 10 on Pluto, and Final Fantasy 4 and 7 on Earth. If you want to know more about my thought process of placing these games on these planets, I highly recommend you check out part 2. In the following series of videos, I will put everything together now that I have placed the games on certain planets and in chronological order. Part 3 will focus on the timeline of the post-Sundering worlds of Final Fantasy II, 16, and 15. Sit back and relax as we deep dive into timeline theory territory. Naturally, since I'll be discussing the beginning and end of these games, there will be many spoilers. So continue at your own risk. To start off, I need to introduce some key characters, places, events, and theories from the pre-Sundering games that will connect Final Fantasy VI, 2, and 15. Final Fantasy XI introduced avatars in which some are called sleeping gods. They are mortal beings whose actions in life garnered favor from the dawn goddess Altana. Celestial avatars were raised to the heavens as constellations in the night sky. These include Alexander, Garuda, Ifrit, Leviathan, Odin, Shiva, Titan, Ramu, and Chaos. Terrestrial avatars are servants of Altana and were mighty beasts tasked with protecting the mother crystals. These include Bahamut, Carbuncle, Diablos, Fenrir, and Phoenix. Mystery avatars of unknown origin include Atmos, Kate Sith, and Siren. Final Fantasy Type O would be the first occurrence of Pandemonium, a sanctuary of death or land of judgment. Agents of death can be summoned against mankind, the living, by its ruler. In this game, it was controlled by the servant of Lindsay named Gala, who possessed Marshal Sid to carry out judgment against Class Zero. In Final Fantasy XIV, it was used as a research facility that created monsters and was headed by the Convocation member La Habrea and his wife Athena. La Habrea is a light scion whose dark counterpart is Matthias the Corrupt of Final Fantasy XII, who is said to be imprisoned in hell for eternity. Furthermore, Final Fantasy Type 0 would be the first game to create Magitech, which is technology powered by mother crystals. In the case of this game, the Tiger Crystal's energy was used to fuel Magitech weapons created by the Militis Empire. Magitech is only mentioned in a few other Final Fantasy games, including its introduction in Final Fantasy VI and subsequently in Final Fantasy XIV, 15, and 16. Final Fantasy V introduced the Void as the initial state of the universe, which is darkness, and that all worlds were born from the Void, and the elemental crystals beckoned life or light. As mentioned before, the sundering of Final Fantasy XIV's planet created reflections, and some were rejoined successfully while others failed. The 13th was lost to a flood of darkness, creating the planet for Void Scent, while the first was lost to a flood of light. Lastly, Final Fantasy XIV makes a major connection to most in the post-Sundering era through a certain race of beings. The Liberate race are bunny-like servants of Hydaelyn that use the moon as a vessel to travel the universe. In Final Fantasy IV, they are called Hummingway and found on the Red Moon and the True Moon. The tale that connects them to many other Final Fantasy games is that of the creator and his recording crystals. In Final Fantasy IV After Years, we learn that the crystals of their planet and the moons were created by the creator to study evolution. These crystals could very well be in other worlds, as enemies from Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 are released from them. For those that know the Final Fantasy games, one can see many connections right off the bat to Final Fantasy 2, but Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy 16 share many elements that influence my placement of Final Fantasy 16 to immediately follow Final Fantasy 14. I hope to further convince you that Final Fantasy 2 follows Final Fantasy 16 and they share the same planet. Furthermore, that Final Fantasy 15 will follow Final Fantasy 2. But before I discuss the flow from Final Fantasy 14 to Final Fantasy 2 to Final Fantasy 15, I want to establish my theory of how the Final Fantasy solar system was arranged post-Sundering. To save time, I will summarize the following slides, but feel free to pause the screen to read for yourself. Essentially, as stated before, the other planets will rise from the sundering while others would disappear due to the rejoining. In the case of the Final Fantasy universe reflecting our own, the celestial bodies of the Kepler belt are remnants of the rejoined worlds. Final Fantasy XI's planet, which again I place on Saturn, will separate the old planets from the new planets. Witnessing the chaos of the old planets, Hydaelyn called on the Lipporites to craft recording crystals imbued with elemental powers to govern the new and emerging worlds. They set out in their moon spacecraft and gifted the planet of Spira with spheres that could record memories. The blue planet and the Lunarians received elemental crystals that evolved to materia. The first would receive elemental crystals to keep balance of light and darkness. Eos would receive one crystal to combat a blight, while Gaia and Terra both received one mother crystal each. While Gaia's mother crystal stayed as one, Terra's would be divided and rejoined a few times over its history. As for Valisthea, Ultima is already shaping the world to his liking, so Hydaelyn would not be able to stop this planet from repeating old mistakes, unfortunately. Final Fantasy XVI follows Final Fantasy XIV in my main timeline, as Final Fantasy XIV and XVI share many elements in their world, including icons, aether, and mother crystals. The main deity of Final Fantasy XVI's planet Valisthea is Ultima, who fled his blight-infested, decaying homeworld for a fresh start. He created the icons Phoenix, Ifrit, Shiva, Odin, Bahamut, Garuda, Ramu, and Leviathan, with the mechanic of dominance and a chosen one called Mythos. I believe the icons were created based off of the avatars from Final Fantasy XI's world that was probably around when Ultima was living on his home planet ages ago. Mother crystals siphoned energy from the life force of this planet called Aether. During his long slumber, Ultima's creations, namely humans, would cause another blight on this planet, much like his home world. Once awakened, Ultima sought to recreate the world from the destruction of mankind, but he was defeated. I am proposing that one of the preserved 5 reflections would become Valisthea, and Ultima claimed it. His home world I placed on the dwarf planet of Gong Gong, and Valisthea on Jupiter. Furthermore, I don't think his story ended there. As Ultima is god of Valisthea, he could have fallen and became Satan of the future time in Final Fantasy II. Why Final Fantasy II, you ask? There are many connections between Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy II. One of the major themes between the games is resistance against a self-appointed absolute ruler, as the people desired free will. In Final Fantasy XVI, it was Clive of Rosaria and his allies who fought against their creator Ultima. In Final Fantasy II, it was the Wild Rose Rebellion of the Kingdom of Fynn, fighting against the Empire of Palamisia led by the Emperor Matthias. Both games are in a medieval setting and emphasize religion and churches. In Final Fantasy II, churches are used as healing and revival spots. Specifically in Final Fantasy II, a statue of a goddess is inside these sanctuaries. In Final Fantasy XVI, you encounter different religious groups who worship either a goddess and her wyverns, as seen with the Gregorian Church, or they worship the Mother Crystals, as seen with the Crystalline Orthodox. There is one ancient religion, the Circle of Malleus, who recognize Ultima as their creator. In addition, Satan of Final Fantasy II and Ultima of Final Fantasy XVI both seek a vessel to possess in order to enact their ultimate rule over the world. In Final Fantasy XVI, Ultima seeks to use Mythos or Clive as his vessel. In Final Fantasy II, as told through a novel, the ruler of Hell, Satan, possesses emperors of Palamisia, endowing them with the power to summon demon hordes from Pandemonium. Satan's soul is protected within the Stone of Eludia. Lastly, in Final Fantasy II, the Forbidden Tome holds the spell of Ultima and is guarded by Leviathan, who is in the waterways near the Mysidian Tower. Interestingly, Leviathan is only summoned, quote-unquote, to appear in Final Fantasy II, although Final Fantasy II is one of the two titles that don't have summon beasts, the other being Final Fantasy I. It is also important to note that Final Fantasy II didn't have crystals, but magic was used through tomes. Airships are not unique to Final Fantasy II, but they did have the Dreadnought airship. In Final Fantasy XVI, the dominant for Leviathan was frozen in time by the people of Mysidia. Clive removed Leviathan from his dominant, and Leviathan became a part of Clive, which displeased Ultima as he declared Leviathan an impurity of his desired pure vessel in Clive. Airships were not used in Final Fantasy XVI, but we do see a fleet of them in the downloadable content, Echoes of the Fallen. An ancient civilization tried to use a Magitech to create their own mother crystals, airships, and iconoclasts, or mechanical icons, and a version of Omega. The people were originally servants of Ultima before they waged war against him and he struck their civilization down. Although Mysidia is also a location in Final Fantasy IV and Magitech technology is in Final Fantasy VI and 15, I do not strongly connect Final Fantasy 16 to those games as much as I have done to Final Fantasy II. Based on all that information, this is my proposed flow from Final Fantasy 16 to Final Fantasy II. In the case of my timeline, no other game occurred between them. Due to Ultima referencing Aether, Mother Crystals, and Icons, he is aware of Final Fantasy XIV's Aetheries and how their world was structured. He proceeded to create Valisthea in a similar way. Upon his defeat, the Icons and magic were lost to the world. Ultima probably ended up in the Void and became a Void Sen, like the many beings of the 13th Reflection. He gained access to Pandemonium from Final Fantasy Type 0's world and became the King of Hell with its hordes of demons. He came back to Valisthea at a future point in time in which the creator from Final Fantasy IV restored magic in the form of his recording crystals in order to study evolution, and these recording crystals were in the guise of magical tomes. He battled for supreme rule again, but his soul is trapped in the Stone of Eludia, and the Forbidden Ultima Tome is created to hold some of his power. The icon Leviathan was summoned to guard the tome, and it shall only be used if Pandemonium should arise. However, Satan aka Ultima can possess the mind of rulers from the Empire of Palamisia to lead a campaign for world domination by crafting an army of demons from hell. Emperor Matthias may be a reincarnation of the Convocation member La Habrea, since he is a light counterpart to the Dark Xion, Matthias the Corrupt, so he holds a light and dark soul. The Empire created the ultimate warship called the Dreadnought, possibly with the knowledge of ancient airships to raise many settlements. In the end, the spell Ultima is casted to send Pandemonium back to hell. The Stone of Eludia is destroyed, freeing Satan's soul, but he is defeated and sent back to hell. The Emperor's defeat led to his body being split into a light form who rules over the heavens and a dark form who rules over hell, possibly due to his association with the Xion, La Habrea, and Matthias. When defeated, he curses the humans, telling them that they will always suffer from war before he fades away. Drifting in an interdimensional rift, the Empire will make his way to other worlds and seek to conquer them. As I place Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy II on Jupiter, a main feature of our solar system is the nearby asteroid belt. Jupiter has a strong gravitational pull that captures asteroids and meteors and forces them to orbit between Mars and Jupiter. As mentioned in part 2 of my series, the Emperor has a signature move called Starfall, which is essentially calling down a meteor. Again, star and planet are interchangeable, so he may be summoning a fallen planet. As the Emperor Matthias makes an appearance in Final Fantasy Stranger of Paradise, and I placed Final Fantasy 1 after a few games, I believe the Emperor had plenty of time to travel the universe and conquer other worlds. The remnants of those worlds are now part of the asteroid belt. The methods I believe he did this was by summoning meteors with parasitic creatures to other planets he intended on conquering, or turning others into parasites that he can manipulate to conquer the planet. We would see the parasitic-like Yevon and demon-like Unalesca from Final Fantasy X plunge the world of Spira into a spiral of death. Meteors would land on Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles planet with the meteor parasite, and Final Fantasy XV's planet with the arrival of the Meteor of the Six. In all cases, these parasites led to an increase in fiends and demons. This leads me to my next game on the timeline, Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV's world of Eos is said to be shaped by the Six who descended from the heavens. The Astrals Ifrit, Shiva, Ramu, Leviathan, Titan, and Bahamut ruled over this world, and humans were created in their likeness. They could very well be incarnations of Final Fantasy XI celestial and terrestrial avatars. The world originally suffered from Shiva's ice age before Ifrit granted mankind fire, which allowed them to grow into the ancient civilization of Solheim. At some point in ancient times, a meteor fell to their planet, but it was caught by Titan, preventing great destruction. Some localized translations of this tale have connected the meteor to harboring a photophobic parasitic organism responsible for the Star Scourge. The parasite will infect the host, causing them to mutate into a demon, which will produce light-absorbing miasma. By absorbing the light, the world would be plunged into everlasting darkness, and the plague would further spread as the parasite would easily propagate. It will take around 2,000 years for the planet to face this fate, hastened by the Forsaken Arden. In the chaos of all of this, Omega awakens. In this world, the Magitech weapon Omega was constructed to destroy the gods by the ancient people of Solheim. However, Omega is seen transversing through spaces from a portal which can be connected to Omega traveling through the interdimensional rift that connects all worlds in the universe. Omega targets Noctis, who had gained godlike power through his ancestral lineage connected to Bahamut's gifts of the Ring of Lushai and the Crystal. An optional boss, the presence of Omega is still important, as again it will connect back to the pre-Sundering world of Final Fantasy V's Planet R. Omega's fought during the World of Ruin stage in Final Fantasy XV, leading up to its dramatic ending. Final Fantasy XV has two different endings. In the original game, the planet is healed from the Star Scourge through the sacrifice of the King, the Oracle, and the Astrals. Demons disappear and light returns to the world. The end. However, the ending was expanded or even changed a little bit for the Dawn of the Future novel that expanded on Bahamut's treachery. Although Ifrit started the War of the Astrals by waging war against humans that wronged him, and Bahamut laid Ifrit asunder on top of the Rock of Ravito to prevent Ifrit from destroying mankind, ironically, it was Bahamut wielding the Ultima Sword, well actually many swords at once, who had the intention of destroying the world along with the plague using Terra Flare. Ultima Sword, trying to end mankind, sounds pretty familiar, But anyway, the other Astrals, Noctis, Luna, and Arden were able to stop Bahamut. However, magic is lost along with the Astrals, and the planet of Eos is cured from the Scourge. As for my theory, the Astrals returned to the planet and subsequently the interdimensional rift, waiting to be beckoned elsewhere. The world of Eos was saved and thwarted its vulnerability to the Emperor's conquest. I believe the Emperor would think of another way to weaken this planet in the future. However, this wouldn't be until the time of Final Fantasy VIII, which I place towards the end of my timeline. One more thing to mention before I close out this video. The main theme song of Final Fantasy 15 is called Somnus and is sung in Latin. Somnus is a Latin word for sleeping, and upon finding translations of the rest of the lyrics, I noticed some information that could support Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 8 sharing a planet, namely the mention of a sleeping god. However, I will wait until the next part to discuss my reasoning for placing Final Fantasy 15 before Final Fantasy 3 and Final Fantasy 15's connection to Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 4. So stay tuned for that. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification button so you know when the next part will drop. Let me know your thoughts so far in the comments section. If you like the sequence of the games, I implore you to play them in this order and see how it flows. But until then, I will catch you in the next video. Take care.